Two notes before we begin. First, you can find the handout for the talk in the comment section below. And second, you can find a link to the longer paper as well, in case you're interested in reading it. I thank you in advance for your comments and feedback. So in this talk, I'll be talking about the right to emigrate. By the right to emigrate, I mean a moral claim right to physically leave a state's territory. And I'm going to argue for three theses. First, that it's surprisingly difficult to justify the right to immigrate. Existing justifications are at best incomplete. Second, that considerations of relational equality can help better ground this right. And third, that the resultant egalitarian argument for the right to immigrate implies a limited, though distinctive, right to immigrate. I'll start with the negative argument. I'll consider three positions which aim to justify the right to immigrate, and I'll argue that these positions are, at best, incomplete. My claim won't necessarily be that we should reject these positions. It's just that they leave out, I think, an important part of the story. So consider a first view of the right to immigrate. According to this view, the function of the right to immigrate is to secure people's basic rights. When one's basic rights are violated, one has a claim to move states and seek the protection of those rights elsewhere. Now, I think this theory is extremely appealing. It adequately explains why refugees and other necessitous migrants have claims to move and seek protection. The problem I just want to highlight is that this theory is limited in scope. It can't explain why the citizens of affluent democracies have a right to immigrate, if they do. For example, it can't explain why the citizens of Norway have a right to immigrate. Their basic rights aren't usually threatened. In fact, there's probably few places that they're so well protected. So I think while this account is an important part of the story of the right to immigrate, it can't be the whole story. So let's consider a second and much broader view. On this view, people have fundamental interests in freedom of movement. Autonomy interests, for example, interests in associative attachment, etc. These general interests ground a completely general right to freedom of global movement. And this entails, as a constitutive part of it, a right to immigrate. Now, I too find this theory to be somewhat appealing. I'm not going to take a stance on whether it's the correct theory. The problem with it is, I think, that it can't coherently explain the distinctiveness of claims to immigrate. The account rests on positive interests in pursuing one's attachments, projects, and plans elsewhere. And as such, it lacks a general account of the distinctively backward-looking interests a person might have in leaving one's state. So I think even if we endorse this account, we have reason to believe it's leaving out an important picture, part of the picture of the right to immigrate. Now let's consider a third account that attempts to fill in this picture. This account I call voluntarism. On this account, having a right to immigrate is a necessary condition on the existence of political authority and political obligation. This account goes back to Locke, and on Locke's view, people tacitly consent to the state's rule through their continued residence. But this consent, one might think, is only valid if it's freely given, and it's only freely given if people have a right to refuse, a right to immigrate and leave the state's territory. Now, this account has a storied history, and it too has a bit of appeal, I think. But the main problem with the account is just that I don't think that residence, even if we have a right to immigrate, constitutes a valid form of tacit consent. This is because I think consent, even in this case, given the substantial costs attached to exit, is not sufficiently voluntary. So I've given you a brief preview of why I think some prominent accounts of the right to exit fail. I haven't considered all accounts. But I hope I've done enough to motivate the claim that we should look for an alternative basis for the right to immigrate. And in the next part of the talk, I'm going to briefly sketch an argument of this kind. So my argument begins with a familiar egalitarian idea that's popular in recent literature on relational egalitarianism. And this is the claim that we have complaints against standing in hierarchical or deeply stratified social relations with other people. That is, it matters that we relate to one another as equals, and it matters specifically that we aren't subordinated to or put in a position of inferiority to anyone else. This kind of view of equality has been defended by people like Nico Kolodny, Elizabeth Anderson, and Daniel Viehoff. And the paradigm it aims to capture, in which the sort of intuitions behind it are most clear, are cases of caste and bondage, wherein one is subject to a sort of socially entrenched hierarchy with stratified social positions. Now, I'm just going to be assuming this account and exploring its consequences rather than offering an argument for it. Let me highlight one important feature of this account first. On this relational view of equality, social hierarchies or problematic relations of subordination only exist when there are genuine social relations between people. There's no hierarchy between you and some distant but very powerful Martians, and there's no hierarchy between you and, say, the Roman Emperor Diocletian. So claims against hierarchy or claims against inferiority presuppose, as it were, genuine social relationships. Now, I've introduced the idea of a claim against inferiority or hierarchy, but let me say a little bit about what constitutes a kind of social hierarchy. And what I say here will be admittedly brief and sketchy. There are different ways to fill in the details, but I don't think most of those ways will matter for the result I want to get. In my view, drawing largely on the work of Nico Kolodny, unequal social relations of a problematically hierarchical kind obtain in virtue of two factors. The first is disparities in power. So you and I, prima facie, stand in a problematic hierarchy when you have significantly greater power over me. And this notion of power is broad enough that includes physical force, but also de facto authority. So here, I think the paradigm case is one of bondage, right, where the master sort of dominates the slave. A second way to stand in a problematic social hierarchy is to be subject to relations of unequal social status. And these obtain in virtue of widely entrenched social norms, which bestow upon some people greater consideration than others. So by greater consideration, I just mean certain characteristic forms of favorable attitudinal or social response of the kind that are characteristically associated with relations of hierarchy. Here, some primary examples might include the deference that people are shown, people who are higher caste, for example, are shown. And the general paradigm of social status inequality here is one of caste relationship, or sort of the social distinctions that are made within feudal ranks. Now, let me make one important qualification about these views. My claim isn't that all relationships of unequal power and unequal status give rise to an all things considered complaint. This is because these inequalities can be tempered or made less problematic by the presence of certain factors, such as being limited in scope or duration, one's power being subject to higher order control, or the power being avoidable without cost. The claim is just where these kinds of tempering considerations are absent, we have a prima facie claim against hierarchy. Now, drawing on this idea, relational egalitarians typically suggest that it provides a pungent diagnosis of part of the problem with political rule. This is because states wield vastly greater power and authority over their subjects. But the state's power is just the power of those who govern it: public officials, representatives, heads of state, etc. They, the thought goes, wield asymmetric power over the rest of us. But the state's power is not bound by the kind of temporary factors that we find in other social relationships. It's largely unlimited. The state exerts vast control over our lives, and it's difficult to avoid without cost. So the thought is that inequalities in political rule and in the distribution of political power in particular threaten to create a kind of social hierarchy between us and those who rule us: public officials, representatives, and persons who wield greater material influence. Now, the usual response to this problem among egalitarians is to adopt a kind of transformative solution. And in particular, relational egalitarians have often argued that social equality requires a fairly demanding kind of democracy. Because democracy, so the thought goes, distributes political power equally, and so resolves the complaint against hierarchy. Now, I too endorse this general democratic solution to the problem, but I think this solution has some important limitations. The first is just, as egalitarians frequently acknowledge, actual democracies don't meet the requisite standards. Achieving social equality requires a quite demanding form of democracy in which people have real equal opportunities for informal influence, and actual democracies, all of them, are quite far away from this standard. So the argument doesn't tell us much about what rights and entitlements egalitarianism ground under conditions of injustice. The second point is that even an ideal democracy would still contain perhaps a great deal of political inequality. This is because democracy might equalize power between voters, but plausible forms of democracy are representative. And democracies don't equalize power between us and representatives. They may, as egalitarians have argued, temper those power inequalities by giving us a share of higher order control over representatives and bureaucrats who run the state. But that doesn't amount to fully equalizing the social relations in question. It may be the best we can do in terms of creating structures of governance, but there's still a prima facie egalitarian problem. So, drawing on these limitations of the egalitarian solution, I'm going to make the case for why I think the right to immigrate can serve as an important supplement and corrective to egalitarian theories. And I'm going to make two kinds of arguments for this position. The first argument I call the remedial argument. It argues that if you're in an unequal relationship and you can't, without unreasonable cost, transform that relationship into a relationship of social equality, you have a right to exit that relationship, as doing so allows you to escape the inequality embedded within it. So here's the thought, put intuitively. Suppose you're in a deeply hierarchical marriage with your dominating partner. One way to fix your marriage is to transform it into a relation of genuine equality. But another way is to dissolve the marriage, to dissolve the relationship altogether. And I'm claiming that at least when you can't do the first thing, you have a right to do the second thing. So let's unpack the argument somewhat more carefully. Here's the thought. First premise, claims against social inferiority can be addressed in one of two ways. By equalizing the social relations one is in fact in, call this transformation, or by exiting those relationships, call this avoidance. And this flows from a general feature of relational egalitarian positions that I highlighted earlier, namely that they presuppose genuine social relationships between people. Premise 2, where transformation is not, that transformation is often not a real option. Actual states are sites of entrenched inequality, and it's difficult or costly for us to transform these relationships in a suitable way. But from premise 1, where it's not possible to transform a relationship, one has a right to avoid it, a right to extricate oneself from those social relationships of hierarchy. However, and this is crucial, the state's power and authority is importantly jurisdictionally bounded. When you're in the state, you're largely subject to its laws. When you're outside of the state, you're much less subject, at the very least. So it seems that exiting the state's jurisdiction is the only way to escape the state's power and authority and the hierarchical relationships that are created by it. That's the first argument. Here's the second idea. There's a huge difference between being in an unequal social relationship with no possibility of exit and being free to leave that relationship. Having the ability to exit a relationship plays a constitutive role in making that relationship less hierarchical or less problematically unequal. So to fix intuitive ideas, let's return to our marriage case. Suppose you're in that same bad marriage characterized by power inequality. Now suppose one of two things can be the case. In one case, you're part of a state that's deeply patriarchal and doesn't allow you to get a divorce and doesn't provide any social support for people who leave their partners. In the second case, you live in a state that allows you that right and that provides robust protections for people seeking to exit their marriages and various kinds of social support. The claim here is just that the hierarchy adherent in the first kind of marriage is made much worse by the lack of exit options than the hierarchy in the second case. This is not to say that the second case is an ideal of equality or that we shouldn't seek to transform the marriage in question. It's just that the badness of the inequality is in some ways mitigated or made less drastic by the presence of exit options. So the thought here is that there's a constitutive connection between exit and equality. And this is what the second argument draws on. So let's go through it more carefully. The first claim is just that having an ongoing real freedom to exit an unequal social relationship makes one's objection to that social inequality less pronounced, makes that inequality less bad in some way. Now, there's different ways one could understand this claim. Perhaps it's because it makes the reach of the power inequality in that relationship less extensive. Or perhaps it's because one has an easier, non-costly option to avoid, and that just reduces one's complaint. I'm going to remain neutral on this. The second premise is just, again, that the state's power and authority is jurisdictional. And so having a right to immigrate of a robust sort makes that state's power more escapable. So if all this is true, it seems that the right to immigrate makes the state's power less objectionable. It, like democratic control over one's representatives, can play a role in tempering, even if not eliminating, the social inequalities adherent in political rule. So let's take all of that on board for the moment. What I want to do now is just argue briefly that this picture of the connection between exit and equality offers a derivative argument for a limited right to immigrate with an I. Now, the standard understanding of the connection between immigration and immigration is just that there's a universal right to immigrate, but no corresponding right to enter or immigrate. And if my argument is true, I think the asymmetric understanding is false. This is so for two reasons. First, In order for the right to immigrate to play its constitutive function, people need real exit options. So a merely formal right to immigrate doesn't suffice to realize the value of equality. Now, you might think that this argument is on its own inadequate. You might think this because even if it's true, it still needs to be shown that other states are under a duty to admit. But, and I'll suggest this just briefly, I think this can be shown in the following way. The thought is that states' power over their subjects is partially constituted by people's exit options. So the significance of an inequality between a citizen and their state is partially a function of the fact that those citizens cannot leave their state. And this is determined by states' immigration policies generally, which have the net effect of denying many people exit options. So I think it can be shown that states aren't innocent bystanders here. Rather, they are collectively obligated to do something to redress the inequality that they produce because they play a constitutive role in producing it. A final objection to this line of thought is just that my argument imposes too much of a burden on individual states. But I think this problem too can be avoided. This is because I'm not arguing that everyone has a right to enter any state that they choose to. Rather, I'm arguing that states are under collective duty to institute a migration system that effectively protects people's exit option. And they can do this in a way that fairly distributes the costs of protecting exit options. So I think it can be shown that states are required to institute a kind of global migration regime, which at a minimum ensures that each person has a number of decent options to immigrate, even if this system falls short of open borders. And such a system, I think, could be designed in a way that manages the burdens that fall on individual states. That's my talk. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to hearing your feedback in the comments section. You can also contact me via email if you have further thoughts about the paper. Many thanks.